Hello everyone, Eric here, also known as the Nascent Nimrod, and I present before you today my thoughts on the land back movement and its relation to the left. Before we begin, I want to say that the following is my opinion alone and is in no way meant to be representative of any of the other people in this video, or anyone else for that matter. As always, if you have any criticisms of me, my opinion, or the video, please leave them down in the comments. Let's begin. In case you are unfamiliar, the term land back was purportedly popularized as recently as 2018 by R-Nail Tailfeathers, spinning into a hashtag and resulting in the creation of many movements and protests around the US and Canada. One of the most notable was the protest on July 3rd, 2020 at the Black Hills region of South Dakota, aka Mount Rushmore, where land defenders shut down entry into the area in order to protest former President Trump's upcoming speech and raise awareness of the sacred nature of the region to the Lakota and other indigenous tribes in the region. From there, other groups were created to deal with the fallout. One of the most notable was the NDN Collective, headed by Nick Tilson. This group organized and created the Greater Land Back movement, launching it on Indigenous Peoples Day, what was formerly Columbus Day, 2020. You can get a general sense of what that group stands for, I think, from the following clip.
To our relatives at Bennington County, do you hear us inside of there? Our relatives inside of Bennington County, we wanted to remind you that you're not forgotten, that we love you, that we remember you, that we know that you're in there as a result of an unjust system. And us, we came together, your relatives, to stand with you as we stand against the President of the United States, as we fight for our land. And we remember you, and we'll make prayers for you. So we're here to stand with everybody throughout this nation to call out white supremacy, to call out an end to systematic racism and oppression of our communities and our people.
And of course, if you are interested in any of the groups I mentioned in this video, you can find links to my sources down below. So that briefly chronicles the rise of the most recent conception of land back, but it is an idea that has a long history here in the US and in other colonized parts of the world. Let us take a brief overview of the primary principles upon which the idea is based. Consider this brief paragraph by Ronald Gamblin, a coordinator for 4Rs, a youth group set upon redefining relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. So what does land back mean? While these words seem straightforward enough, this phrase encompasses a complicated and intergenerational web of ideas / movements. When I hear Indigenous youth and land protectors chant, "Land back," at a rally, I know it can mean the literal restoration of land ownership. When grandmothers and knowledge keepers say it, I tend to think it means more the stewardship and protection of Mother Earth. When Indigenous political leaders say it, it often means comprehensive land claims and self-governing agreements. No matter what meaning is attached, we as Indigenous nations have an urge to reconnect with our land in meaningful ways. End quote. From that, we can start to get a picture. But to further our understanding, let us consider the Land Back Manifesto and its answer to the question, what is land back? Quote, "It is a relationship with Mother Earth that is symbiotic and just, where we have reclaimed stewardship. It is bringing our people with us as we move towards liberation and embodied sovereignty through an organizing, political, and narrative framework. It is a long legacy of warriors and leaders who sacrificed freedom and life. It is a catalyst for current generation organizers and centers the voices of those who represent our future. It is recognizing that our struggle is interconnected with the struggles of all oppressed peoples. It is a future where Black reparations and Indigenous land back coexist, where BIPOC collective liberation is at the core. It is acknowledging that only when Mother Earth is well can we, her children, be well. It is our belonging to the land because we are the land. And I implore you to pay particular attention to this section, as it will become relevant later. So I think at this point we can safely say that Land Back is a movement on behalf of indigenous and colonized peoples to achieve land reclamation, sovereignty, and an attempt to redefine land ownership in a way that will better serve those aforementioned groups. And if I am to present that position in the most positive light, perhaps once land back is achieved, native stewardship of the land will act as a positive example of how non-indigenous communities might enter into a more sustainable relationship with their own lands. Now, to understand my criticism of the movement from a leftist perspective, let me explain my understanding of land ownership from that perspective. To a leftist, private property is an invalid way to make use of the means of production. Land is one of those means of production. Therefore, it should not be held privately. Now, does land being held by a tribe count as being held privately? It is perhaps made use of in a way that benefits all the tribe members, and perhaps each member has freer access to that land than they would otherwise, but from my understanding, the same rights would not belong to non-indigenous who live in the area. This would be a problem, as the land would not be held in common to my view of that word. That sounds like private property to me. That is to say, property held for explicit use by and to explicit benefit of a particular group of people. Second, let us take a closer look at the indigenous and their relationship to tribe and nation. And this is the part where that section of the Land Back Manifesto becomes relevant. It seems to be the intent, and is in fact explicitly stated by many activists, that indigenous peoples are attempting to construct a coherent nation. Here we mean nation to be any group of shared identity, not necessarily coterminous with a country. Out of a shared cultural practices, values, and perhaps most importantly a shared history of oppression. Included in this concept of nation would seem to be black people, people of African descent living in the Americas whose ancestors experienced slavery specifically, because of that shared history and continued experience of oppression. We are to understand, perhaps, that within the confines of that larger indigenous nation, and in the lands controlled thereby, black people would hold the same status as members of indigenous tribes. Thus the appropriateness of the term BIPOC, or Black and Indigenous People of Color. But I don't see any explicit mention of other minority groups, nor do I see any mention of the common struggle presented by class. This is a problem from a leftist perspective. One of the explicit goals of leftist thinking is to build class consciousness, recognizing the shared struggle of the workers, read proletariat, against the owning/capitalist class, i.e. the bourgeoisie. In other words, the entire land back movement seems to favor a model based on racial and national allegiances over and above those based on class. If a general revolution is to be achieved as conceived of by leftist scholars, then it will need a class consciousness that the current land back movement seems to deny. How else could aid be guaranteed to the proletariat if some members of that proletariat do not fit within the categories predetermined to receive benefits from these lands? My final leftist critique comes down to usage and productivity. Within the various articles and videos I've watched on the subject of land back, a great deal of fervor is displayed with respect to reclaiming land and heritage, but little is said about what it is to be done with it once reclaimed. The fact of the matter is, traditional methods of making use of the land will likely not be able to furnish tribe members or nation members with resources they need to survive. It will require modern infrastructure, and that infrastructure is not cheap. In order to avoid the trap of getting the land only to find it more beneficial for the tribe to sell it back, I think it only correct for land back to demand funding or donations of the machinery/materials necessary for productive use of the newly acquired land. It may seem like a small point, and perhaps it is one already being considered by land back activists and simply not displayed for public consumption, but the entire basis behind a reorganization of society is that it can be done based on the plenty supplied by extremely efficient resource gathering and production. In summary, I think it's fair to say that the left has some interests represented by land back, but in order for that support to be universal, the land back movement will need to re-examine how tribal ownership is conceived of, move past a national organization structure, and reclaimed not just land and sovereignty, but the means to make those lands sufficiently productive. Finally, I'm obligated to discuss some leftist views on the movement that are different from the ones I have presented here today. Consider this. Take from The Mayhem Calling.
Now, to be clear, as the ancestor of colonizers, I am firmly in the camp of, yes, give it back. Even if it won't directly benefit me, it is the most equitable thing to do, and will not drastically affect me in any significant way, unless the colonized people decide to seek retribution, which, well, I'll get into in a little bit. Basically what I'm saying is that a lot of land back activists, they aren't trying to seek retribution. But I have to acknowledge that it is a very slight possibility. And as I shall reiterate, and as I shall back up Lou on this, it is completely up to the oppressed people to decide what to do in that situation.
In other words, there are some people on the left who do not consider the decision made by land back activists and BIPOC in general to fall within the scope of leftist ethics. If they did, they would surely critique any possible violence against colonizer members of the proletariat as counterproductive towards the larger goal of revolution. I can only say that the people who hold this position seem to hold it based on an empathy felt towards the plight of black and indigenous people in particular, with no or very little thought as to how oppressed peoples outside those communities might be affected. This mindset is a form of classism and a form of racism, and no, I do not mean reverse racism. But that's all I have to say on the matter. If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If not, feel free to give it a thumbs down. And as always, if you have some point you disagree with me on or would just like to offer some supplemental information, go ahead and leave a comment below. Have a good day.